Morning, everyone. How are you all doing? So last year, I was actually part of an exodus of indie game developers who left Portsmouth, England, to move to New York City. That exodus consisted of myself and this morning's speaker, Sam Barlow. I bring up that connection because many of you may know Sam from his game Her Story, which incidentally was set in, I suppose, a fictionalized version of Portsmouth. So I think that's still the only game that I know of set in Portsmouth. So I actually met Sam very soon after he'd left his role as a director at Climax Studios to go indie. And I remember his ardent hope that his unconventional live-action-based, video-based game about analysing interview tapes of a woman accused of a crime would work out. 2 years on, Her Story has swept up just about every video game-related award there is going, including BAFTAs, and gained the attention of the public and media, even outside of games. So Sam is now an executive creative director at Interlude, using the medium of interactive streaming video to tell stories. And that's something I really admire about Sam and his work. He's a really excellent and considered storytelling thinker crossing mediums, and his credits certainly tell that story. You may also know him as the writer and lead designer behind Silent Hill Shattered Memories, which played with that permeable boundary between our real selves and who we're trying to be in the game. And going even further back than that, Sam's personal practice in interactive fiction goes back to the late 90s, when he was really active in that scene, the best known of his works being his award-winning and genre-defining Isle. So there's a lens through which we can see all game design as at least implicit storytelling, thanks to our tendencies to narrativize and notice patterns in the things we do. Vihart kind of touched on that yesterday. We might say that the only thing that changes might be the degree to which we foreground that implicit versus explicit storytelling in our game, in our work. So I admire Sam for telling those more explicit stories through game design and for telling them in ways that we might not expect. So I'm really excited to welcome him to the stage to hear more about his process. Everyone give it up for Sam Barlow.
Hi. That was a far more intelligent and considered introduction than I think the talk that's going to follow it. So when I saw the time slot was 10 a.m. Sunday, I took a deep breath, and of all the weeks to end up speaking at 10 a.m. on a Sunday, this wasn't the best one. But I've designed the talk so it will fit with this time slot. There's no pictures or interesting visuals. I've kept it very light. There's no great insight or detail. So if you want to just lean back, feel free to close your eyes, and we'll all reconnect in 30, 40 minutes. I'll try to get to the questions as quick as I can, because actually looking around the audience, I think your questions are going to be kind of more interesting and penetrating than what I have to say on my own. So the talk here is called Game Designing Like a Writer, How Her Story Was Constructed Entirely on Paper, which is actually a figure of speech because it was actually constructed entirely in Excel, which is kind of like a modern version of paper. But that's actually a figure of speech because it was actually done in Google Sheets. But I still call that Excel in my head. So when I set out to make Her Story, there are a couple of things I wanted to play with. And as Mitty said, this was my first independent game after like 10 to 15 years of working in traditional console games. And so there were a few things I wanted to try out on the side of actually what the game itself was and how that was structured and how we were telling a story there. But also the process. And process is something that I've thought a lot about. And I'm fascinated by screenwriting. I think like screenwriting, all the different storytelling forms is one of the most interesting because it's so structured, so controlled. And I was fascinated by the way that in kind of ideal processes, you would get a movie script written by a single writer, and they would write it on their own in a dark room or a coffee shop somewhere over 6 to 12 months. And I was fascinated by the fact that a screenplay was this document on paper that was describing the blueprint for something that would end up being a piece of visual storytelling, where you'd have hundreds of people coming together to make this thing, and all the technology and all the complexity of actually shooting a movie. I was very jealous of the fact that those creators could sit in this very protected, safe space to be creative, to be very pure, and create these documents and kind of outline things using their imagination, put it on paper, and that would actually stand the test of being essentially representative of the final movie. It felt like Hitchcock, I think, used to say that the point where he had a locked script, the movie was done. The rest of it was just a formality and the boring bit. Something else that I used to think a lot about was when you're playing a game, and actually, in my experience, when you're making a game, it's very easy to fall into the trap of just how compelling even the shittiest gameplay loops are. I remember I once had a meeting, it was a reasonably important meeting for a game I was directing, and the meeting went on for like an hour and a half, and I spent an hour of that meeting running the character round and round in circles. And everyone else in the meeting thought that I was really, really pissed off, and this was some kind of message I was trying to send out. But actually, I was just really enjoying running this character round and round in circles. And one of the things that everyone who's tried to sit down and write knows is that the enemy of creation, the enemy of writing, is distraction. You know, if you give a writer even the ability to change the font in a document, they will sit and play with the font. I force myself to just stick it in Comic Sans or go into a text editor, because then I'm done and I get distracted. And I was aware of like the process of making video games, especially on a larger scale. It's very easy to fall into the trap of just getting immersed in the experience and playing it and become used to what you're doing, and just losing the perspective and getting distracted from the core piece of creativity. And again, in terms of people I was jealous of, I would be jealous of people making a very pure action game where they could create a prototype, a really ugly prototype, and essentially have captured the magic of their idea, and from there be able to move forward. And I would look at that and I'd be like, wouldn't it be great if there was a way of making a narrative game where you could do the same thing? You could have an ugly-ass prototype and you could kind of lock the magic and say, this thing's going to work. And my experience of working with narrative in kind of bigger budget video games was that, you know, you'd have like a one-pager and some ideas, and they'd be sketched out, and then you'd start making the game, and there'd be a team of 100 people running on it, and it was just a very messy process. So as I say, I was very jealous of screenwriters being able to go and sit in a room and create something pure, and I wanted to see if I could figure out a way of doing that for a narrative game, where I wouldn't be getting distracted by putting things in a game engine, in as much as Excel or Google Sheets isn't a game engine. And so this was kind of the thinking I was going with when I was trying to make Her Story. And so knowing that I had enough money to run for about 12 months, I said I'm going to spend 6 months of this not even touching a game engine, just nailing this thing on paper. And there's another aspect to this which I think is quite exciting for me, which is, again, looking at the way a screenwriter would work. You can take a movie on paper and look at all 200 pages of it, and you can understand if this thing is going to work, or if it has the potential to work. And even earlier in the process, the most exciting part of screenwriting for me is the outline process, which is actually like 50 to 75% of the time spent designing a movie is beating out, say, the 40 plot beats and looking at it at that simple, granular level and figuring out if your story works. And there's no point moving beyond that point if it doesn't work. And it's this very honest, brutal step where you look at it, and it's very easy to say, well, look, 99% of my story is working. I'm just going to jump into scripting this thing. And the dialogue and the step pieces and then the visuals will just kind of carry it, and will solve these problems in the writing. But anyone who has any discipline knows that you can't do that. You have to look at this thing and say this is 100%, and the design and the structure of this thing works before moving on. And that was something I was attracted to. In the same way that's the same with like an action game prototype, you can sit and play it in a very pure form and 100% say whether this thing's going to work or not. And so this was something I was trying to aim for in Her Story. So the first thing I did, once I had the idea of what Her Story was going to be, which, hands up who hasn't played or have any idea what Her Story is? okay, we're good. I'm sorry, this is there's no pictures or anything, so I'd love to know what you think the game is at the end of this. So everyone knowing what her story is, the crystallization of the idea for me was going for a walk one day, and I'd been trying to think of how to make a police procedural game, how to do something in the kind of storytelling space, how to do it on an indie budget, how to do something that was different, how to explore all these ideas of how I wanted to work. And at some point, my subconscious just kind of tapped me on the shoulder and said, here's the game. And that was, these are video clips of somebody talking, and you can search against them using a simple word search. And I think the constraint of having only 5 clips came a bit later, but essentially that core of the idea was there. And so I started thinking about how this would work. And all of my instincts from having designed games before was, although the experience in my head I was trying to present was of this open experience where you could type anything, naturally I kept going back to trying to script this thing out. And so I downloaded like every different piece of flowchart software, and in each time I'd blame the software when it wasn't working. I'd be like, this, maybe if I have something with nicer curvier arrows that kind of docks quicker, I can get in the creative space. And so I just did hundreds of pieces of shit like this. And every time I'd get like 10 minutes in and just be like, this isn't feeling magical, this isn't working, is this idea wrong, does this idea suck? But I just kept trying to do it, and I kept trying to script it out and make these connections. And then whilst I was doing this, I was also doing a ton of research. So I was reading loads of books about police interviews, the psychology of them, the history of them, the legality of them. I was reading up on interesting cases that were tying into the story I wanted to tell. I was doing all this fun stuff that involved sitting in a garden at my flat in Portsmouth and in the sun, because it was sunny for, I timed it perfectly, so when I started we had a small window of sun in England. And I came across, so I was looking for real life examples of this stuff, and there were some great things. One of the reasons that the thing ended up being a video was finding this huge amount of video footage of real life interrogations online that had been shared as in the public interest or leaked or what have you. But what I also came across was this guy, James Porco, who attempted to murder his parents. I think he murdered one of them and the other survived. And they had the entire transcript of all of the interviews with him and the police, and it was online in a .txt file. So I was like, oh, this is cool. I can use this as a kind of very simple prototype for this idea, and see what happens and see if it works, and just kind of play around with it. And it was very easy to do that. So I stuck it, let's see if this will load. Yeah, I stuck this into Google Sheets again, and this is. So when I said I designed it entirely on paper, that's cheating really, because this is essentially a prototype. So I dumped all of Porco's lines from this transcript into Google, and then just used a filter to kind of replicate the idea of searching through this. So here it's searching against murder. But very quickly you could kind of have fun with this, and I just started playing it, and because I tried not to read up anything about this case, I just grabbed the transcript and dumped it in. And so I started playing it as if I was playing her story, and found the whole experience quite interesting and fascinating. So stuff would come up and I'd be able to follow leads, and so I start asking questions about who is this guy, does he have a girlfriend? He does. Fairfield, where's this? And I realized that you had this experience that's very similar to what you would see on TV of a police detective, of like when names and places and stuff come up, you get very excited and kind of jump on those. So I go, Fairfield, what's going on here? Oh, we have a names. Oh, names are super, super exciting and sexy when you see those come up. I'll be like, oh, so who's this Sarah character? This is his girlfriend. Oh, we're learning more about her. And then I'm seeing that there's nuance as well to the words he was using, whether he calls his mother mom or mother. And all this was stuff that I'd read about in these police textbooks about the pronouns people use, the tenses they use are all actually really relevant, and I was seeing this actually play out in this transcript. And I started to pick up on some kind of threads running through this. So we see here, we're hearing about his mother. My grandmother has money but nothing. We see $25 at Halloween from my grandfather. And I started picking up these threads running through everything of money. He talks about money a lot. And I then kind of realized, I went and read more about the case and discovered that the reason that he killed his parents was because he wanted their money that came from their life insurance. And this kid did a really good job of actually, he never confesses. Most people don't confess when they're speaking to the police. He actually does a really good job of answering all their questions, but when you actually look at it with the POV of a detective, when you start interrogating it through this kind of search mechanic, the threads become very apparent. And you see that money is this connection between everything. And I got very excited at the way that the words you search would kind of curate and create these little sets of search results. So you would see all these different cross-sections of the police are asking him these questions about what do you do on weekends? Do you have any plans for summer? Do you have a girlfriend? Do you have a job? Like everything they asked him, at some point he would be able to get back to money, and money would just keep reoccurring and reoccurring. And that was super exciting to me. And through playing this crappy prototype, I found myself, the sensation I was experiencing was kind of slightly magical and something I hadn't really felt in another game before. The kind of sense of exploring with some level of kind of blinkering this story in the way that made something that if I'd read his whole transcript as a linear transcript, it would have been very dull. There was lots of talking about just very dull everyday things, but the experience of having it chopped up, served up to me, having me try and wrestle the subtext out of everything, having me fill in the blanks, just him talking about his uncle John in this. First time John comes up, I'm excited. Who is John? What's going on with John? And then just something he says when he's talking about his uncle throws me back somewhere else. And this experience of exploring a story felt new and fresh to me, and it reminded me of how I wanted other games to play. So there's a wonderful thing, a game called Portal from the 80s, not the Valve one, which presents a story with the setup that you are exploring this database as an astronaut who's returning to Earth to find everyone gone. Similarly, I remember a very defining moment in my career as a game designer was as a kid getting the Infocom game Deadline. And this was a game that was a murder mystery game, and you were playing the detective, and it was like a closed room mystery. It was fairly standard. But in the manual, there was a paragraph which I misread or misinterpreted, which said something like, you are the detective, the way in which you investigate this will change the outcome, something like that. And my interpretation on that was, wow, the things I do and the evidence I find is going to change who did the crime. And it sounded very exciting. And this idea of these very kind of fluid, organic, tactile stories through video games was always something that I wanted to experience. And every time I would think the promise was there, I'd kind of bang up against something that had been scripted as a flowchart or was more constrained than it should have been. And in interacting with this Porco transcript, I had a kind of taste of something that felt more fluid and magical. And so at that point, I uninstalled all of the flowchart software and decided, well, look, there was no game designer behind this transcript. This was just a series of characters, the detectives, the suspect, in this wonderful gladiatorial interview. And it produced this, and the natural language and the ability for us to embed things with subtext, the fact that he was being evasive, the fact that the police would have multiple agendas and asking certain questions, created an interesting experience for me. And I also noted that typing in words and getting nothing back didn't feel crappy. It kind of felt interesting because I was now describing this space. By finding things that weren't working, I could kind of get a handle on what was going to work. And that was exciting. And it also reminded me of the sensation of watching, like you have this scene in, you probably don't anymore because cop shows are having to constantly reinvent themselves, but like the classic cop show would always have a scene, like in the older ones where someone's looking at microfiche and they're in a library looking through old newspapers and they just sat there for hours and hours and hours looking at stuff which is boring and useless, and then they'll find some magical thing. And now it's done with laptops and databases, as in her story. And I found that I was experiencing that same sensation. So I was very excited about this. So that threw me back into the process, and I decided I'm just going to write the heck out of this thing and not worry about the game design aspect at all. And what I'll do is I'll go away and I created my character biographies, timelines, all my kind of background documents, all my research, did all that fun, creative writing stuff, and then jumped into the writing process. So I wrote out all of the interviews. There are 7 interviews, and I wrote them out roughly chronologically. And I would go into it knowing for each interview, this is the agenda of the woman sat in the seat, this is the agenda of the detective speaking to her. In between the last time they spoke, they've discovered this new piece of evidence, or they're deciding to push this. And I scripted the whole thing out, and I wrote all of the interviewers' lines. So this was just playing out as a series of 7 scenes. And in the writing, what was very important to me was I was writing from the character out. So there's a term in screenwriting which is writing from the inside out, writing from the character out, which is that although you have the perspective of these are the themes I'm trying to explore, this is the structure, and this is where my act break is going to happen. When you sit down and write the scenes, you try and sit in the headspace of the character. And maybe it'll take you in a different direction, but then you're trying to write something that feels authentic and has an authentic voice. So that's what I tried to do here, and sat and I wrote out these series of interviews and let the characters talk to each other, and ended up with a script that I liked. I did a read-through with the actress where we saw which things worked and didn't work, did some more tweaks to it. And then this was the point where I felt that as much as the Porco transcript worked, surely as a game designer, I should be able to make it work even better. So this was the process that I call the balancing process, but in my head, I visualize it as being like painting chiaroscuro. It has nothing to do with that. But when I used to do lots of painting, and when you're painting light and dark, you'll do a thing where you'll do a pass on all the shadows, and you'll step back, and you'll look at the piece, and then you'll go in and you'll draw in some highlights and bring things back out again. And there's this kind of constant back and forth where you're pushing things back, pulling them out, and slowly what you're painting takes shape. Similar, I imagine, to kind of the process of creating a sculptural work, where you're in at the moment and you're chipping away at some little detail, then you step back and just keep refining and balancing and tweaking. And this was the process I went into. So the first thing I did was having this script. This might take a while to load. I took the script that I'd written, I ripped out everything the detectives were saying, and I stuck it in Google again. And this was actually, this spreadsheet used to crash every computer, and if I tried to use it offline, it would crash and break, but the magic of the cloud, this project was only possible thanks to the computing power of the cloud. So I should have put that on the box. So what I did was stripped out all of the lines, stuck them in here, and extracted all of the unique words that were being used. And so then the first piece of math was very simple. It was literally totting up which words appeared in which clips. And so you can see here that the most popular word is the, which appears in 158 of the 270-something clips in the game. And then having this ranking of how frequently the words appeared, I would score each clip. And the equation, I had like a bunch of different equations, but it would be something like taking the score of each word. So if the score is how frequently it appears, summing the score of all the words in a clip, and then dividing it by chronologically how late in the day it appears, because that reduces its chances. I probably squared a few numbers here and there because I learned as a game designer that if you square things, it just makes a more funky thing, and people would assume that it's a very clever function if there's things being squared in it. And so I had this ranking of the words, and I had then this ranking of the clips themselves. So I had a score attached to each clip, which essentially told me how interconnected is this clip with the others. And so that score assumed that somebody playing this game with no wider knowledge of the English language, assuming they're navigating by seeing a word, which is true of names. So like if a name like Sarah appears in the text, you had no prior way of guessing that the word Sarah was going to be in there. So the first time you see a clip with Sarah in it, it's now linking you to all the other clips with Sarah in it. Obviously, there are English words that you might just pull out of your head. So you might just search for love, affair, alibi, death, blood, because you know what genre you're in. But the process that I would go through was initially looking at those words, and I was particularly interested in, if Google's going to let me scroll down, yeah. I was particularly interested in the words that had 5, 4, 3, 6, 7 entries attached to them, because as you'll know, the constraint on the mechanic in her story is that you're limited to seeing 5 clips, and you see the first 5 clips with that word used in them. So I was looking at those because there's something really exciting about typing something in and getting 6 or 7 responses, because it feels like there's a few things just out of reach. But as well, what I'd seen in the Porco transcript was that the thing I really liked about this was this curated set of clips, was this idea of the story being told by these disparate clips. And this, for me, was actually like the purest piece of storytelling in the piece. It was the most fascinating part of it. And it's true of, like, if you read a Hemingway short story, and he uses his iceberg theory, where he only has the tip of the iceberg in the text. You know, all of the story is happening off the page. If you watch a movie, all of the story is happening in the montage, in the arrangement of the edit, in the stuff that isn't necessarily on screen. And when I was playing that Porco transcript, that for me got very exciting, because here was a narrative video game where actually a lot of the magic and a lot of the story was happening in the arrangement of these clips. It was almost like an exercise in film editing and montage with kind of a heavy dialogue bent. So I was looking at these, and I'd go down my list and I'd see that there might be a word that's particularly evocative. So, you know, if there was a word like met or find, maybe that's not that exciting. But if there's a word like wedding, hair is actually very useful in this project, husband, wife, words like this seem very, very evocative. So what I'd do is I'd then look at these, and if they had 6 clips being returned, I'd look at it, and maybe the 6th clip is like super evocative, and if that was in the selection you were returned, it would create a really interesting kind of mini narrative. So then I'd go in and I'd figure out which of the other clips could I remove that word from. Instead of saying wedding, I'd just have it assumed in the subtext, or I'd kind of rephrase it or use a synonym. And so I could go through those and kind of curate the set that was being returned to you. And at each point, I wasn't conscious of any larger diagram or flow or construction. I was just looking in the moment at this little piece of the painting where I'm doing some kind of light or shadow. And then the alternate side was I would then go and have a look. No, it's on my other one. Go on Google. I would then go and look at the clips themselves, and I would look at the lowest scoring clips, because these were the problem clips. This is, it says latest word analysis, so this was early on in the project. This is very good indie game designer source control. There's probably one in there that's like even later latest, final latest. So I'd look at the kind of the lowest scoring clips, the shittiest clips. So things like this is a good example. She has a line where she says, "Cute, what ages are they?" And this is a fun scene because this is the point in the story where she's got into a conversation with the detective about the fact that he has children. And actually, it's after he's dug really deeply, I think, into like the implication that people have been having an affair. And he's like really digging into her sex life with her husband. So she's very aggressive back to him. And then this was her trying to actually level things and kind of reduce the tension in the room. She starts asking him, does he have a family, does he have children? And he gives her his wallet, and it has a photo of his kids in it. So for me, this was a fun moment, because when you're making something like this, you're constantly looking for what can I do visually different in these clips, because if it's 2 hours of a woman sat in a chair talking, it's exciting when you discover a clip if there's even the smallest thing happening, whether that's her stirring her cup of coffee, so here receiving a wallet that the guy's passing over and looking at it. So she says, "Cute, what ages are they?" Which was, again, like in the writing it from the character out was a very natural thing to write. But no one is ever going to find this clip unless someone decides to search for cute they will never find this clip. And I don't think anyone is going to just randomly come up with the idea of searching for cute. So in this case, I think I ended up, what I would do is I would go and look at my word list, and I would look for words that had less than 5 that would tie into this. And this process was really interesting to me because what it forced me to do was to make sure that everything, like I'm obsessed with, when it comes to writing for the screen or for the page, like the use of imagery and symbols and constant image systems, either in the spoken word or in the visuals that are on screen in a movie. And like a mark of a good piece of screenwriting for me is that you don't have kind of redundant systems of imagery. If there is a recurring image, either by accident or design, you've got to figure out a way to wrap it into the overall piece and the themes. And this process would kind of force me to do that. So this particular line here where it says, cute, what ages are they? I think I added something like, as she's looking at the photo, she says, you must really love them. Because love was a word that, let's say, it had 4 things being returned against it. And now I'm wrapping this particular line up in the idea of the different meanings of love in this character's life, the sense of love between parents and their children. And it's just adding to that picture, and it's making this particular line tick off some boxes, be more thematic, and then also work within the actual game design of this piece. So this was the process. I'd go through the clips, look at the worst offenders, fix those, then go back, check that the words themselves weren't now getting overloaded, and I'd just go back and forth until this felt balanced. So, there are things, like I say, there's only so much that my shitty Excel formula knows. So a line like, no, I'm okay, fuck, wasn't scary to me because it had a low score because there's only 3 or 4 places where she says fuck. But I knew that, especially if it was me playing, people are going to search for swear words. At some point, even if they get frustrated, like, what else can I type? Someone's going to start typing swear words. So I was less worried about those. Another good example was there was a line in there, there's an element of the plot where there's a watch that is found at the crime scene, and in the classic murder mystery style, it's been broken, and so there's a fixed time on it, so it helps with people's alibis. And there's another scene where, again, it was kind of more visual. She's been handed an evidence bag which has this watch in it, and she looks at it, and I think in the original line she just says, yes, that's Simon's watch. And this occurs quite late in the story, so at that point, searching Simon is not going to find you this clip. And are people going to search watch? Again, maybe if they found one of the few other clips that mention it, but it's a very low-scoring clip, and it was a nice clip that should be easier to find. So again, I looked at my list of words that weren't used that much, and again, in terms of enhancing the richness of the imagery and the actual storytelling, this watch now, when she looks at it, she mentions that it was a wedding gift. And that it was given to her by Diane, who is Eric, the dead man's boss's wife, and that she has such good taste. So instantly now, this clip, which wasn't getting picked up very easily, is now also being thrown into the mix with wedding, with this character of Diane, who pulls in lots of different threads. And as well, this watch, which was there just as a MacGuffin, just as this piece of the plot, now has all this resonance because it was a wedding gift. And the plot hinges on a gift given at a different anniversary. Again, making people think about weddings, the different characters, the different relationships between the different married couples in the story is very useful thematically and in terms of understanding the story. So this is another example where just this iterative process of crunching things in Excel allowed me as a writer to come in and fix things without being worried at all about how they fitted together. So pulling back, like the things to take away from this that I'm looking to take into other things that I do, and kind of thinking back as well, were present to some extent in cooler stuff I've done in the past, is finding a way, if you're making a pure narrative game, if you're making a very strongly narrative game, is to find a way to keep the story alive in the writing. Writing a story in itself is one of the hardest, most painful and dull things you can do. When you throw in the fact that there's all this interactivity and potential for whatever your game is, it could be branching, it could be that there's this database game mechanic on top of it. Like, there's always a chance that you can break your thing. Like, what you don't want to do is have your story feel mechanical. There's some great examples. If you've ever seen John Ingold or Meg Giant talk about creating the game 80 Days, John gives the example that the way their system works, the way their stats on the back end worked, the way the structure of their journey planning worked, when they sat and wrote individual scenes, they didn't care about how it fitted into the overall structure. They had a system where they could just throw stats on random scenes, where they would just come to a city, not caring how you'd got there, and just write something interesting in the moment about that city. And actually, more profoundly, Meg said that she was the person that wrote this story, and she couldn't tell you how to make X, Y, or Z happen. She couldn't tell you how to get this bit of story to happen in Tanzania or wherever. And if she couldn't, then the audience and the player at the end of the day wouldn't be able to either. So that, for me, is the hardest part of the craft of telling an interactive story, is you have this thing which is fundamentally more mechanical, more designed than most other stories, and you absolutely don't want the audience to see that or grok that. So finding a way when you're creating it, to keep the story alive. So for me, this process on her story was the point where I was writing the story, I was writing from the character out. And then later on, I was throwing Excel and numbers at it. But even then, I wasn't having to worry about the larger structure. The numbers were just telling me there's a problem here, come in and fix it. And then I would fix it as a writer. Taking a wild leap. Similarly, when I made Silent Hill Shattered Memories, as Mithu mentioned, that was a game that very much fitted into the kind of template of a game with branching scenes. Different versions of scenes would occur as you progressed through the game based on things you'd done in the past. But we had a setup there that was psychologically analysing the player and filling in this numerical profile of the player as they went. And when we came to write scenes for that game, we would just sit down and we'd look at the scene and what was its narrative purpose and what were the characters doing, and then think, what would be interesting things that could happen? What might the characters do? And then after the fact, fitting that to a particular psychological profile. So again, it was using numbers and number crunching and structure and figuring out a nice formula and structure to things that allowed us as writers to live in the moment and write from the character out. And I think that is something which, when it's then delivered to the audience at the end of the day, they feel, because it doesn't allow them to grok the mechanics. And further, it does something that I think is one of the most interesting things about this medium, which is it kind of puts the player in the same place as the creator. When I was making her story, when I played that Porco transcript, the feelings that I was feeling reminded me of what it's like to actually write. Like, if I'm writing a linear screenplay, there will come a point where I have everything laid out and I'm jumping between scenes non-linearly, and I'm coming into it and I'm seeing it from a different angle and I'm tweaking it. I'm looking at it from this character's perspective, from this other character's perspective. And I'd actually, because I'm terrible at organizing, I would remember there's a scene where someone buys a goldfish. And so I would then just like Google in my screenplay for goldfish to find that scene. And what I found when I was playing that Porco transcript was some of that magic felt to me like the magic of writing. Because like I say, writing is a kind of shitty, boring process, but once the words are on the page, that's the fun bit. That's when you feel like you can wrestle and mold and sculpt this story, and that feels magical. And for me, what I was trying to do was put the player in that same space. And I think that's the wonderful thing about telling stories interactively, is sharing some of that magic, not in a way that people like Roger Ebert might kind of jump to conclusions, this is what interactive storytelling is. Not in a way where you stop the story and say, right, what happens next? You tell me a story. But in a way that the audience gets to feel like they're almost sat by the side of or on the lap of the creator as the story is being told. And I'll finish, I always end up reading this out when I do talks about her story. This was, whilst I was doing my research, one of the things I was doing was, I was reading loads of old J.G. Ballard short stories, because as a creator in the 60s, he was doing lots of fun avant-garde stuff. Like he had, there's a great short story that was told entirely as the index to a fictional autobiography. You just see all the index entries. There was a story told as a questionnaire, a kind of unanswered series of questionnaire questions. So I went back and I got the Atrocity Exhibition out to read, because this is a work which is full of all these disparate pieces united by imagery, and it's very kind of non-linear. And I realized that there was this introduction to the edition that I had. And when I read this, I just got super excited, because this, for me, crystallized this feeling that I'd felt that I was trying to evoke in the game. So I'll just read it out, and then we can do questions. Readers who find themselves daunted by the unfamiliar narrative structure of the Atrocity Exhibition, far simpler than it seems at first glance, might try a different approach. Rather than start at the beginning of each chapter, as in a conventional novel, simply turn the pages until a paragraph catches your eye. If the ideas or images seem interesting, scan the nearby paragraphs for anything that resonates in an intriguing way. Fairly soon, I hope, the fog will clear and the underlying narrative will reveal itself. In effect, you will be reading the book in the way it was written. I pinned that up on my wall because I was like, this is so exciting. Like the idea of this sculptural narrative, and the player or the reader is driving it. They're exploring, their curiosity is what is leading them through the story, and they're putting the pieces together. And then this final sentence, in effect, you'll be reading the book in the way it was written. That, for me, was super, super exciting. So let's make more things like that.
So there is a microphone just behind the screen over there, if you want to grab that. And I'm going to grab the microphone here as well. And if you'd like to just join me, taking a seat. Okay, so we're going to open up for some Q&A. So I actually have a question for you.
Okay.
So
it's not about Portsmouth.
It's not about Portsmouth, no, let's not talk about Portsmouth. We'll do Portsmouth questions later. So what was your sense of robustness of, certainly as you were playing the Porco script, what was your sense of robustness of the fun of the game holding up in the instance that a player might type something or, figure out some key component like really, really early on? I asked this because when I watched my sister play her story, she typed in a really, really crucial keyword as like the second thing, but then she's the kind of person who, like, within the first 10 minutes of watching Sixth Sense, will just go, oh, he's dead, isn't he? So. So.
I haven't seen that movie.
Sorry.
There's several long answers to this question. I think there's a really long one where I talk about the history of the detective narrative. We'll skip that one. I think that ultimately there's a thing that is really fun about storytelling. And this is an example I was given as encouragement to cut more in the writing process. But the person who gave it was like, and this is a very dated example now because it's about watching something on TV live. But he's like, if you turn on a movie on TV halfway through the movie, within 2 or 3 minutes, you will have an idea of what's happening. You'll have picked it up. And that's exciting to me because it kind of speaks to the fact that it's like any story is almost like a hologram, right? Any small point of it, especially if it involves performance, will contain the wider context. And as a human being, you can jump in halfway through a movie and kind of figure out what's going on. So there's that sense of like, it's actually quite hard to break a story. And then there's the fact that, as we'll all know, if you have a favorite movie, you will watch it more than once. And actually, the act of watching a story or reading a story the second time is richer because you have free dramatic irony. You know what's going on in a character's head. You know what the outcome is. So you can stop worrying about that. And actually, I will go back to the detective thing because it ties into this. I'll do it quickly. But if you look at the history of the detective genre, you have the original detective stories, let's say popularized by Agatha Christie. They're these puzzle pieces. The story starts with a murder. There's an investigation. It's a big puzzle. You're trying to figure everything out. The detective character is very thin. Like the detective character is just there as an audience proxy. And at the very end of the story, Poirot sits everyone down, explains the mystery. You go, I should have thought of that. Oh, that's so clever. We have an amount of those stories, and then the audience becomes more and more sophisticated, and we need new ways to excite them with a detective story. So then you have that. If that was the Whodunit, the Whodunit. I'm getting ahead of myself. You then get onto the Whodunit, which is most popularized by Columbo. At the start of a Columbo episode, you see who does the murder. You know who committed the crime. And then we cut, and in comes Columbo. So now every scene has this extra layer of dramatic irony because you know who did it. And you're thinking, does Columbo know at this point? How did they get away with it? What are they thinking? Oh my God, they must be really sweating because he's talking about their ex-wife and we know that they aren't. And it becomes a much richer, more interesting thing. We move on, and again, the audience has become used to this. They've seen enough episodes of Diagnosis Murder to last several lifetimes. And the kind of modern detective story, most popularized by the Scandinavians, is the Whodunit. And in these modern detective stories, you don't actually care about the murder mystery element. Like, they'll go through the motions of being like, oh, here's a red herring, here's some details of the crime. But often, they'll just be MacGuffin nonsense and it's atmosphere. And the real interest of the story is, why did this happen? It's the psychology of the person that perpetrated the crime, or even the detective. And you'll see, the popularity of the serial killer genre came out of this, where it's like, let's create a very deep psychological portrait of the person that's committed these crimes. So it's actually a much more sophisticated work, because although it's built on all of the knowledge and trappings of this genre, it's actually a deep psychological portrait. So knowing that, my understanding of how this game would work was, even if you knew who did it, even if you knew how they did it, that isn't the real meat of the experience. You could play it in such a way that it plays out like a puzzle and you get a whodunit. It could be that you kind of fairly quickly figure out what's going on, but you're like, exactly how did this take place? And then you get the whodunit. Or, as your sister did, you could immediately be like, oh, that's what happened. Why? What is going on with this character? What happened? And then you dig deeper and deeper and deeper. And it was an experience that I myself found where, again, like at the outset of making this thing, with all those flowcharts, I was thinking of it more as a murder mystery. I was thinking your POV is that of the detective. And I watched all these videos, and I had a week where I wasn't in my garden, where I was actually painting all of the house, justifying to my wife the fact that I was working from home and not getting a wage. And whilst I was painting all the rooms, I was listening to and watching all this video footage of the Jodi Arias trial. Of the interrogations of Jodi Arias before she went to trial. And there's hours and hours of this stuff. And again, initially I'm watching these videos and I'm thinking, where is she going to slip up? Murder weapon, alibi, I'm treating it like Cluedo. The more and more time I spend with her in this room, listening to her talk, my POV shifts from being the detective to being sat next to Jodi. And now I'm worrying about her as a person. I'm empathizing with her story, and I want to know more about her life. And I want to listen to her talking about her life and how she got to this place. And so seeing that my own evolution across that week was from the mystery is all that matters. As a game designer, what's the solution? To actually, this is a character portrait. That gave me the confidence that if I could deliver a story with enough interest, if I could deliver characters that were interesting enough to people, that that is the core process, that they would end up seeing this as a character portrait. And just there is no end to a piece of portraiture. You can just keep looking and digging and seeing more details about this person.
Great, thank you. Okay, so let's take some questions. Yes?
I was wondering how much, if at all, you've tested your script with your Google engine, and what surprising things you found when you had players actually play.
So the question was, how much did you test your script? Just reading the camera. Did you load your script up into your Google spreadsheet and search through?
So I did it myself as part of the testing. What I didn't do, which was like a brave or foolhardy thing, was, as much as I was testing it in text, I felt like a lot of the actual DNA of the piece was going to be in the video, was in the visuals, was in the subtext, would be in how it played in terms of empathy, in terms of having a character acted out on screen. So I didn't show it to anyone at the text stage, and I locked the script, reassuring myself that the numbers in my Excel formula with all the random squares seemed to say that this thing was well balanced. Seemed to say it would work, and locked that, shot all the video, and then I pulled all the video in, and then I had a version that I could test on people. And I tested it on 15 people, most of whom were kind of game designers or narrative designers, and it worked for them. So I was like, whew. But at the same time, I was like, they're probably saying it worked for them because they're being nice, and they're game designers. And then I took it to EGX in London, and for 3 days had people play it and was recording all their data so I could see the words they were searching for, the routes they took, were they even interested. And actually that version of the build didn't have subtitles, so I was just watching people over their shoulder, and every now and then I'd see them be like and seeing this kind of this body language of the kind of haha eureka, and then doubling down and bending over the keyboard was like, oh, this seems to be having the right effect. And then afterwards, crunching the numbers, it was like, yeah, it's kind of working. So it could have all gone badly wrong, is probably the answer to that question. But no, I didn't test at the tech stage.
Your question's right in the back over there.
You seem to have pinpointed like exactly the feeling of the game, like what you were trying to make people live. But I felt that there's a lot of research that came before figuring out, like even searching in Google for the Arco script. The question is, how much research was involved in before you got to that point, and how important was it for finding that?
Yeah, I think, and as I said earlier, it's like there was a point where my subconscious figured everything out. I was just sat there. So when I was working for publishers, I would occasionally pitch them police procedural things because I thought this is a huge genre, this is a huge way of telling stories, and there's very few strong examples in the world of video games, and no one was ever interested. So early on, like I was trying to come up with what is this indie game I'm going to make, and I knew it'd be really easy to make a exploratory survival horror game with a narrative and sell it to everyone that likes my Silent Hill game. So I told myself not to do that, and fixated on this idea of the police procedural thing. And I didn't really know what shape this game was going to take, but something early on that I honed in on was the idea of it being focused in the interrogation room. Like I was obsessed with the TV show Homicide: Life on the Street, if you remember that one, which was one of the shows that for me really explored the fun that can happen in the interrogation room that they called The Box. Actually, you might have noticed this project was originally called The Box when I started it, before I knew that it was about her story. And so I was I decided very early on, if I set this in an interrogation room, if it's about the interview process, then that seems like a very smart indie thing to do, because I don't have to have car chases or locations outside of the interview room. And we're focusing on something that's very character-driven and dialogue-driven, which feels like something that is worth exploring. So I had that in my head. And yeah, then all my research was just broad, fun stuff, just reading all these police manuals, watching everything I could find on YouTube. As I've talked about before, like I went, and when I knew that I was interested in telling this story that was about a woman who had murdered, and like statistically 1 in 10 murders are committed by women, which speaks to possibly where the power lies in society. And what that also means is that because it's a rare occurrence that a woman murders, it tends to be kind of more exciting to the media, and occasionally you'll get these kind of big murder trials where people get very excited, like with Amanda Knox, like with Jodi Arias. So I knew that I was trying to tell this story and have an angle on it. So I went and watched Basic Instinct again, because this is an example of the kind of classic femme fatale narrative, which actually is sort of attached to every prominent female murderer, and also has some famous interview scenes in it. But when I got my DVD out, it had as the extras the casting tapes that they did, because Paul Verhoeven really wanted to make it with Sharon Stone, but she wasn't a big name then, and so the financial backers didn't want Sharon Stone to star in it. So Verhoeven went and made these various tapes with her to say, look how good she is. But these were just like casting tapes. So this was Sharon Stone sat in a room with minimal hair and makeup, no costume, awful lighting, bad framing on just a kind of handheld video camera, no cutting or editing, and she's just reading her lines, and then off camera is Paul Verhoeven playing the role of the detective in his broken English. But and I think that massively informed this idea of not having the detective in things. And I watched those videos and I was like, to a modern palette, to like the modern aesthetic, this is way sexier, way more compelling, way more authentic feeling than the actual noir-y, shot, lit, cinematic version of this scene. And that was really the point where I put two and two together, and I combined that with all these videos I'd watched of the Arias trial and other trials, and just so that's when the idea of it being a video thing jumped into my head. And at some point, like, I was just thinking and researching and just letting stuff mull over in my head, and then one day it popped into my mind. So that was, there's no kind of reproducible sequence of events there. It was just waiting for the magic. And again, it was the criteria for me was always, I will know the idea when I see it, and when the idea popped into my head fully formed, suddenly that felt like a very strong, tight idea that at least I would be interested in.
Cool. Let's have just a couple more questions. Yes?
This is a question about directing, because you find out midway through the game that there's these two personas. How did you determine with the actress how similar or different to make those two characters as you were going through?
I mean, there was an amount of kind of discussion and kind of rehearsing around it up front. And we made sure what we did was we shot the two personas contiguously. So we shot all of the Hannah stuff and then shot all of the Eve stuff. And we had like a series of like mannerisms and rules about how such and such a character should act and touch their ring, or and some of it was in the script. Like, I was reasonably thorough to make sure that as I said earlier, like when the police are interviewing people, like the words people use to describe things, pronouns, tense, is very telling, and that was in the script already. So for Viva, the script already contained an amount of this, like whether she called her mother, mother, or mum, whether she called Simon, Simon, or her husband, the tense she used when she was talking about the murder. All these things were kind of baked into the script. But then, yeah, we did a process of figuring out what were the mannerisms and the setup. But a lot of it was, like, Viva is, part of the reason I chose Viva for the project is she's very good. I worked with her on another project before, and I would just give her lines, and suddenly all this subtext would come out of them that I'd either hadn't realized I'd put in or I'd forgotten I'd put in, and was kind of magical. So I didn't want to push Viva too much. So it was, like I say, there was like a rule of thumb of like 4 or 5 things that visually define this character and how she sits and acts differently. But the main thing was just making sure that we shot, so she was, for X number of days, she was Hannah, and for X number of days, she was Eve. And then she could do her own thing, and that would naturally fall out in the performance.
All right, one more question. Who's got a good one? Yes, go ahead.
So since your Google Sheets engine was dealt with the verbal aspects of the transcript along the same lines, how do you deal with the non-verbal storytelling aspects of it? Because actually, I got a lot of the plot out of the demeanor and the acting, but that seemed like something that was done after you had off the script.
No, so it was in the script, but yeah, it wasn't reflected in the Google Sheet. Although actually, I think the Google Sheet has all the stage directions in it, which would alternately screw things up or not screw things up, because it might say in the stage directions she touches her tattoo or whatever, and that would work. But it wouldn't work if it said she is thinking about her husband, and then that would show up as a search for husband or whatever. But yeah, so that was all stuff that was, like, all the visual stuff, like I say, was in the script, which was written, you know, as a piece of visual storytelling. So actually the problem was more, as I was saying with the examples of like the watch and the wallet, there is stuff in there that is cool visually, and so it was more a case of ensuring we could find those clips, because they might be the clips that had more stuff in the subtext or less actually spoken out loud. That's a good question.
Thank you so much, Sam Barlow.